Good morning. Thanks for joining us. We have a great presentation today on Wi-Fi, and I just wanted to let you know that the podcast is produced and directed by Connecting Point. It is a podcast designed for IT professionals to show real-world solutions to IT problems. This podcast is not sponsored by any vendors, and the information expressed in the podcast is part industry best practice and part real world experience. CP Radio is copywritten 2021, and all rights are reserved by Connecting Point Radio. So I would ask before we get started if everyone could please uh, mute your mics, and if you have a question to ask, please feel free to type it in the chat. Both myself and Kyle will be monitoring the chat, so if you have any questions, please put them in there. With that, I would like to stop my presentation and turn it over to our guest speaker today, who is certified as a Wi-Fi expert. He is all things Wi-Fi and frequency-based. So I want to just give it up a little bit for Jeremy Baumgart. Good morning, Jeremy.
Thank you, Dan. Good morning, everybody. I'm going to try not to get too far out into the weeds here as far as super specific things that people have no time to dig into. But I am going to try and really cover some of the meat and potato stuff that I see wrong a lot. Dan, if somebody does have a question, do you just kind of want to stop me and let me know so I can cover it before I get off that topic then?
Yeah, some of it I will just sort of try to answer in the background. Because I think Jeremy and I were discussing prior to this seminar that, we see a lot of things, and a lot of things that we see are repetitive. We see a lot of the same configurations that aren't quite right. We see a lot of the same placements of APs, all of those things that I think many of us who do Wi-Fi, we sometimes just put a Wi-Fi in place with a hope and a prayer that it's going to cover us properly. But I think we're finding that doesn't always happen. So that's why I brought Jeremy in. Jeremy's got some fun tools to show us and some nice ideas on AP. So go ahead, Jeremy.
All right. So I'm just gonna bring up. This won't be all slides, but we'll bring up a little bit of stuff to look at here. Let's present the screen there. Show that off. There, we'll skip that. So, yeah, like Dan said, trying to cover some of the things that we see it wrong all the time. I really just kind of the first line here in bold, your Wi-Fi is configured badly out of the box. Even if you bought the system from us, it's out of the box. It is not optimal. Many manufacturers will gladly broadcast on channels that you should never broadcast on. They will do strange things, moving clients around in ways that don't make sense. Sometimes they'll fully disable half the access point that you paid for with a single checkbox that seemingly is completely unrelated. And while these systems are incredibly robust and they really can put up with a lot of abuse, at the end of the day, when you've got 50, 60, 70, 80 clients on a single access point in your building, you need to give it every chance that you can get to succeed. And really, it's crazy to me when we'll come into a school and they'll be like, well, this room has a performance issue on this day, and it seems like every time I open my laptop up and I look, and it's just under a heavy load, and they haven't given it a chance to handle these situations well. So that being said, probably the biggest thing that people get wrong, and anybody who's seen any of my other presentations will know that I beat this topic to death. But channels are your first and foremost thing. I mean, you could be running 15-year-old access points and maybe even get away with it in some cases, but at the end of the day, if they're configured on the wrong or bad channels and there's no thought given to it, it's going to perform badly. Um, and probably one of the most misleading things on this is that, so in the United States, we have 11 channels. I know this chart goes to 13. This is actually the Japanese specification here, but it kind of shows how they all overlap. Um, when they first made the wireless spec, they expected to have these little 5 megahertz chunks for every channel, and that never happened. And what ended up happening instead is that we get these, the slide says 22 megahertz, but in reality, they're 20 megahertz wide chunks. And then there's 2 megahertz of separation between them. Those chunks all overlap, as you can see here. And what happens is over the air, with when you're talking wireless, it's what's called single duplex, where only one device can talk at a time. So I liken it to, if anybody's ever been to your local county fair and people trying to use walkie-talkies, you've probably, or just using walkie-talkies in general, you've probably noticed that if one person's talking and then another person tries to talk at the same time, you just get garbage out of the speaker. It's just noise and squeaks, and it's just nothing productive happening. And that 100% applies to Wi-Fi as well. The only difference is, instead of modulating your voice, it's modulating your data. And so, that being said, you need to do your absolute best to keep your access points on different channels from each other. Now, there's automatic channel selection, and that's really handy. And I'll be honest, the vast majority of deployments that I do, I leave the channel set to automatic as far as which of these channels it'll be on. The problem is that most of these systems out of the box will gladly hang out on channel 3, which, if you look in this picture, 3 overlaps with, well, every single channel between 1 and technically speaking 8, which you could, if you have one access point hanging out on channel 3, it is going to basically make 2/3 of the wireless spectrum useless. And when you don't have a ton of load on an access point, you can get away with that because no one else is talking at the same time on their walkie-talkies, so to speak. But when you're talking Wi-Fi and you get 30, 40, 50 clients on an access point, and then you end up with 7 or 8 people that are on the 2.4 gigahertz band instead of the 5 gigahertz band of that AP, suddenly you got a teacher saying, hey, why do I got 4 students in my classroom that their internet's not working? Well, it's because you've got access points on channel 3 and 7 and 10 all overlapping, and as soon as one of them tries to transmit, none of the other ones can transmit. Now, that being said, if you do have APs that overlap and they're on the same channel, they can actually work together, kind of like a walkie-talkie. If your buddy's talking over you, you can say, hey, quiet down for just a second. I need to tell this person something. And you can actually coordinate and figure out who gets to talk next. And that's 100% how Wi-Fi works, is if they're on the same channel and they can talk to each other, they can also coordinate with each other. And that is a way better situation than when they're on a different channel that's overlapping, and therefore you can't coordinate with it because they're effectively not speaking the same language. And just to visualize this in a little bit more of a fun way here, I was going to bring up, so this is a frequency analyzer that we have that we use fairly often when we're on site trying to troubleshoot interference problems. And so this guy's kind of cool because I can just look at what's going over the air from a signal perspective. And so I configured a couple test networks here. And we can see I got them configured nice and tidy in this case on channel 1 and channel 6 here. And I'm just trying to unlock my test devices, which are very complicated cell phones here that I'm going to use to create a little bit of traffic. And so this is kind of a best case scenario. We got two networks that don't overlap with each other. And if I start these tests here, we are gonna see we're gonna have a lot of color show up on that graph. And you'll notice that the virtual outline of what the signal should look like for testnet and connecting point 2.4 there, it kind of actually matches the real shape of how that signal looks, which is kind of one of my favorite things about this, that it's a fairly well understood thing. You don't necessarily have to have a super fancy tool like this to be able to kind of visualize how this looks, but it sure does make it easier. And now to show that this is not such an optimal scenario, once you actually take the smoke and mirrors away here, we have a wonderful neighbor here near the office that likes to have their network on channel 3. And as a wireless network engineer, it's just a tiny bit infuriating that we do have the exact scenario that I'm talking about that you want to avoid at our very own office here. And I actually get reports on our dashboard of low performance on our 2.4 gigahertz band whenever that neighbor of ours is using their Wi-Fi heavily. So it's just kind of a real world example of why this matters. Now, that being said, if we hop over to the 5 gigahertz band here, we can actually visualize this here. So they smartened up when they released the 5 gigahertz band to the public, and they actually made sure that none of the channels overlap with each other, with a little asterisk next to it. So if you're looking closely on your screen here, you'll see that these hoops for these different networks, they actually encompass 4 different channels. What's happening there is that you can bond multiple channels together on 5 gigahertz, and technically speaking, you could do it on 2.4 as well, but it should be pretty obvious why that would be a bad idea. On 5 gigahertz, it's very, very common to bond multiple channels together to double, triple, or even quadruple your bandwidth that you have available on a given access point. And so your life's a little bit easier on 5 gigahertz, but, and I don't have an example right now, if one of our neighbors decided they wanted to broadcast a 20 megahertz wide network on channel 112, it would be overlapping with this larger 80 megahertz wide network here. So it's all trying to keep this all balanced in your head of, okay, what do I have for channels? What are my neighbors doing that are messing up my channels? Or more often than not, what am I doing to mess up my own channels? Because these systems out of the box will automatically choose a different channel width, and you can absolutely run into a scenario where overnight one of your access points decides it wants to do a 20 megahertz wide channel on 108, for example, and then you'll have an access point that overlaps across an 80 megahertz wide channel from channel 100 to 112. And what'll happen is in the morning, you'll get a whole bunch of students on that 80 megahertz wide channel. And before that access point that's kind of plopped in the middle on channel 108 realizes that something's wrong, it'll be broadcasting over the top of it and causing the same problem that we had on the 2.4 gigahertz band. So it's one of those things where if you're aware of it and you tweak a couple settings on your access points, you can massively improve just the baseline performance of these things out of the box. And that being said, too, looking at this visual here, you'll notice there's a big dead band. I don't know if my mouse pointer's coming through, but there's a big dead band between channel 64 and channel 100. That is actually where military radar and weather radar hang out. And you can actually see we got a little bit of noise there. most likely due to well, we have a large weather radar station and military base in Sioux Falls here, and you'll see they're doing their thing, transmitting in the middle there, and we don't have any wireless channels there to worry about. But when the government was allotting the 5 gigahertz stuff, initially only the very first four and the very last four channels existed because they did not want people's Wi-Fi interfering with that radar. And so eventually they realized that the wireless radios were getting really good. I mean, you can see these signal bands are pretty tight. You can see there's a little bit of bleed over outside of the rectangle that it paints there, but overall most of the signal is where it belongs. And so what the government decided to do is they're like, hey, you can squish a little closer to our weather radar and our military radar bands, but if you pick up that we're transmitting and you're overlapping with it, you have to move off those channels right away. And so they came up with a technology called DFS, dynamic frequency selection, where basically you're free to use all these channels in the middle here between channel 48 and 149 there. You can use all of that in the middle and usually without any real consequences. But if you're next to a military base or a weather radar station, probably should avoid it. That being said, almost all systems out of the box are configured to not use these. And so if you're trying to run your network at a school and you've got 40, 50 plus access points, you're limited to the four on the bottom and the four on the top. That's only 8 tiny little low speed channels that you can use. Whereas if you actually turn on DFS, you can open up. The math comes out to another 2/3 of the channels can be unlocked and utilized there. And that's the difference between running a 200 megabit per second wireless network that has some overlap and not really a Corvette or a Mustang in the performance world, so to speak. More of a Chevy Impala, and you can go from that to, hey, now we've got 2/3 more channels, and we can run 80 megahertz wide channels, and we can have that high performance, high speed network instead. Which, I mean, I've gone into schools and simply turned on DFS and seen a massive difference in performance and saw the network go from 90% utilization down to 20% utilization, which is crazy. And in fact, the last school that I did that at, they ended up deciding to upgrade their internet connection. This was in Iowa, so they did have to purchase their own. They ended up doubling the speed of their internet connection because they started maxing it out. That and because we improved the performance of the wireless network so much. So that was pretty cool. Let's keep going here. We can hop off the frequency analyzer here and go back to a couple of the slides there. It's gonna let me bring this back up. There's that half duplex I was already talking about there. Let's see here. Here's another good example of some not so nice neighbors here overlapping. This was just a simple app on an Android phone called Wi-Fi Analyzer. Looks like people in the lobby there. Okay, called Wi-Fi Analyzer that visualizes it really nicely. So that being said, and I guess I kind of put the cart before the horse here a little bit. You should be trying to use 5 gigahertz as much as possible because of all the problems on the 2.4 gigahertz band. 2.4 gigahertz shouldn't be disabled, generally speaking. It's very useful, especially if you have Wi-Fi 6, but it's definitely something that if you can avoid having to use it with the potential problems with neighbors broadcasting in the middle of channels and things like that, you're going to be a lot better off. They're by the math, I guess I don't remember the exact count off the top of my head, but you only have 3, so basically 3/4 of this first block of green here available on 2.4 gigahertz. So it's a pretty massive difference. And that being said, depending on the type of wireless system you have is going to change how you can utilize 2.4. So a Meraki system, for example, they actually don't have any active band steering where they can steer a client between 5 gigahertz and 2.4 gigahertz. They have what I would call passive band steering, where they basically can just deny people from connecting to 2.4 if they have a 5 gigahertz antenna on their laptop. Whereas a Ruckus system and an Aruba system can actually actively move clients between the two based off of how things are working in real time. So there's considerations to be had even on just the brand of access points that you have at your school. And then it looks like I still got a few minutes left here. This is also a great example of why hallway access points can cause huge issues here. So this is a wireless scan that I did at a school that basically there is an access point hanging out in the yellow on the left here in the hallway. And we had noticed that we had clients all the way on the other side of the school that were sometimes connecting to that access point. And what was happening is this signal was creeping all the way down that hallway, all the way across the school. And when we already have the problem of channels overlapping and we only have three 2.4 gigahertz channels to begin with, imagine the chaos that this AP is causing on both the 2.4 and 5 gigahertz bands all the way across this school. I mean, that's how quickly that you can lose that edge when it comes to channels, is just one AP being placed poorly can cause a massive set of problems. At the end of this hallway over here, they had some channels that were hard set and some other issues going on. But at the end of this hallway, the Wi-Fi was borderline unusable. And it's not to say they didn't have enough access points. This whole map would be solid yellow to red if I were to show all of the access points. It's just there was so much weird interference happening because of that AP on the other side of the school. And that's also where making sure that you have the resources available to do this kind of advanced troubleshooting, because you can't find this stuff just by like, well, let's just turn it off and on again, let's update the firmware, things like that. You need ways to visualize this and see what's actually going on to find those weird goofy issues where so and so is having issues on Wednesdays and this room has Wi-Fi problems during this period and that kind of thing. And then that being said too, even when you do have one properly placed inside of a room, you still got to be careful with those channels. You can't just let them run wild willy-nilly. You got to bring that app up on your phone. You got to look and see, okay, are they overlapping? Are they doing what they're supposed to? Do I have 6 access points all sitting on the same channel for no reason? Because even though dotted down this whole hallway, they had 10 or 15 access points in total where you see signal here, they still had to be conscious of that and try to keep the overlap as minimal as possible to keep things performing well. And you get strange stuff. I mean, you can see these little tendrils of signal just coming out of nowhere, which is a great example of also why, if you do have your system set to steer clients between different access points and load balance things, you definitely should not be questioning why it does that unless you're having a performance problem. This is a building that the access point, from a scale perspective, was over 200 feet away, circled in red on the left there. But yet their meeting room where they would have conferences with 15 or 20 people was all the way on the right. And we can see we got just a seemingly random blob of really good signal. And I'll be honest, I can't explain why that access point is pushing signal all the way to that conference room, especially when they had an access point literally outside the door on that conference room. But what I can tell you is that when they would have conferences in there, half the people would end up on the access point out on the fabrication floor, and the other half would end up on the access point inside or right outside the door of that meeting room. And it's just a perfect sign of why, if things are working and they're working well, don't question it. I've had people that call us on site just because they're like, well, why is this device connected to this AP? And my first question is, well, is it working badly? Because if it's not working badly, you probably have something like this going on where there's plenty of signal there, and the controller decided, hey, we're going to get better performance by splitting some of these people up onto another wireless channel so that they aren't fighting over bandwidth nearly as much. And I don't have a slide for this, but the final really important concept really to keep inside your head then is that on these channels there's a limited amount of bandwidth. There's only so much time that you can be transmitting data. So there's this concept called airtime, and I probably have time here to pull it up. See here if I can pull up that packet capture. That would be really cool. This piece of software allows us to visualize and capture packets over the air, which is just absolutely invaluable when you're on site. It just you being able to actually see what an access point is saying to a client, and actually see it versus just having to dig through logs, makes all the difference when you're dealing with some of those weird issues and you've already verified that your signal's good. So this should process here in just a second, hopefully. There we go, it's loading. So you can see at the top of this graph here, there's this airtime graph. So this was a network that we logged. Well, it was the Pizza Ranch that we were doing a demo at. And there was, well, you can actually see in the count here, 9 clients connected to that network. And I mean, they were using a pretty decent amount of data. And yet, in this case, we actually had a pretty good scenario where things were performing well. Our peak here was 14% airtime utilization. And I can hover over different spots here too, and we can look at the retry rate and different things like that. It's really fantastic stuff from a visualization standpoint. But I've had people look at just the spectrum graph that I showed earlier, and they're like, well, this is overloaded on this channel. But then I do a capture with this software, and I'm like, I disagree. We're only using 25% of what is available there. We can lean on that a little harder and squeeze more performance out of it. So it and all these concepts really come together and set the baseline for how your wireless wireless network is going to perform. I mean, it comes down to getting your APs on the best channel possible, getting them on the widest channel that you can give them, without having it overlap with other access points. And if it is going to overlap with other access points, you want to make sure it's overlapping perfectly so that they can still talk to each other and coordinate with each other so that they're not talking on top of each other. And then finally, just keeping the concept of airtime in your head too, so that, when you do have that one classroom that only really has coverage from one access point, and think about, okay, if we get 30 kids that are all trying to load video together and there's only one access point overlapping in that area, especially with like a ruckus system where you'll typically deploy them with one access point for every 2 to 3 classrooms, you can potentially run into a scenario where the access point and your internet connection have plenty of load capacity left, but your channel will run out of airtime, especially if you have those skinnier 20 and 40 megahertz channels instead of a nice wide 4-channel 80 megahertz wide cluster of channels all bonded together for that one access point. So there's been times too where I'll manually go in a school and I'll configure the last access point in a hallway to have a wider channel than the rest of the access points, simply because I know there's really no overlap on the end of that hallway. And I I could ramble all day about this and get into more nitty-gritty details and how you can tweak this stuff and manufacture specific settings, but really in most cases we find that people haven't even messed with getting their channels right. And that's the start right there. I mean, you can try every checkbox and feature you want inside your settings, but if you don't get your base configuration with your channels and the channel widths correct, and especially access point positioning correct, it's just not going to work. Do we got any questions in there, Dan, in the meantime here?
Yeah, there's one, and I'll take it in just a second here. Um, just to reiterate, Jeremy, so top 3 things we can do to improve our Wi-Fi.
Top 3 things are going to be, first of all, make sure you're only broadcasting on channel 1, 6, and 11 on 2.4 gigahertz. That's the absolute biggest thing right there, first and foremost. And the sub point of that is going to be don't disable 2.4. It's very useful. The number of scenarios that I've been in that have been fixed by turning 2.4 gigahertz back on outnumbers the number of scenarios I've been in where things were fixed by turning it off. The number 2 is going to be aware of your channels. Use an app to visualize it. I mean, going back to that PowerPoint I had there where I had a screenshot of that Wi-Fi analyzer app. I'll have to flip through this here real quick. I mean, this is a free app. And not to say that this can do everything that you'd possibly need to do, but I mean, if you're just curious if you have a problem, pull it up. I mean, they make equivalents for Apple devices. They even make one for Windows, which I actually have open right now, called Insider. And I have a couple fancy features on this that you really can't use without some licensing. But even this, if you look on the bottom, it'll give you a basic visualization and at least tell you if you have a problem that you either need to spend some time looking at, or if you want to call us and have some help looking at. It'll probably surprise you. It's one of those things where once you're aware of it and you see it, it's going to be like, wow, I have a ton of problems in this corner, and this corner has a bunch of stuff overlapping. I bet that I don't even have the basics right here. So just being aware of how wide your channels are and where they're at is going to be number 2. And then number 3, and I didn't talk about this a ton because really your installer should be handling it more than anything, is avoid hallway access points, avoid putting access points in the ceiling, if anything, just because it's hard to find them later. But putting your APs in good locations and just kind of being cognizant of, hey, there's going to be overlap with these. Think about them like sprinkler heads almost, minus the walls. You wouldn't put 3 sprinkler heads right next to each other. You probably shouldn't do it with an access point either, because you're going to flood that one area. And well, the same thing's going to happen with your Wi-Fi. You're going to burn up a bunch of channels that you could have been using otherwise, which is also a great example of why you can break stuff too, by just, you get that teacher that says, well, I'm having problems in my room. Can you put an access point in my room? No, it should have been planned out, and there shouldn't be a reason to just place an AP in there, because you're gonna burn up channels. And especially if you have automatic channel sizing turned on, inevitably what's probably going to happen is you're going to put an AP in a room that already had great signal, and it's just going to shrink the channels down and give everybody less bandwidth than they would have had otherwise.
Awesome.
So,
yeah. Given the amount of Windows updates and driver updates and everything else, the problem isn't always the access point.
Well, yeah, there's that too. Sorry, I realized I wasn't presenting when I was showing that screenshot, but it's just the Wi-Fi analyzer app there. That's another important thing too. I mean, we've seen it with these Wi-Fi 6 deployments. There are a number of wireless vendors that had to update their drivers for their Wi-Fi 5 cards because they couldn't even see the
Yep,
Wi-Fi 6 network.
correct.
And that being said, I've seen major issues fixed just by pushing out, whether with group policy or however else you want to do it, pushing out the latest wireless drivers. I mean, I've seen schools that are running wireless drivers that are dated 2014 and just blows their mind with that when they load the driver from 2019 that wow, it works way better and we have less airtime utilization and they stay on one access point and it's just way better. Well, when Intel puts out tens of millions of wireless cards, they have a lot of people that complain when something's wrong, and they're pretty good about usually fixing the software for it.
Awesome. Here's the one question. Again, trying to respect everybody's time. We're a few minutes over. I apologize for that. Here's the one question, and we may have to take this offline. With active panels, and I know you've done just a little bit of work on them. Kyle probably has as well. He's on. Is it possible to have active panels, Promethean active panels, see other 5 gigahertz channels other than the non-DFS channels?
All right, so that is 100% going to depend on the basically the year make model. So older panels and older wireless devices can, in some cases, be missing DFS channel compatibility. Uh, and so it's something we really don't see very often anymore. I run into it maybe once a year where a client has devices that just can't use DFS channels. Mostly just because it's been pretty standard for a while now, and that's not to say that some devices didn't slip through. There were some active panels sold up until just a few years ago that did have some DFS channel compatibility missing. Um, so it's really going to depend on the device. But if you do have a device that's refusing to connect to an access point that's on a DFS channel, chances are good that it simply just doesn't support it. And sometimes it's worth trying to work around. Other times it's just easier to let it fall over to your 2.4 gigahertz because if everything's configured nicely, you really should have most of your devices on 5 gigahertz, which should leave your 2.4 largely open for these devices that are falling through the cracks.
Awesome. Good answer. Thank you. Any other questions? I'm not seeing any other questions. Anybody else? Again, if you have topic ideas for us, please send me an email, ddurkey@connectingpoint.biz. Next month, we've got Windows 2022. We also have a couple of other topics set for basically we have December, January, and February planned out. Please log on to our website and take a look at those and sign up. And other than that, we thank you all for your time. Again, I apologize that we've gone over time, but if there's any other questions that you'd have on Wi-Fi or anything that you want to talk to myself or any of our engineers, please feel free to let us know. Once again, thank you for joining us, and we will see you next month.